Right, so as so many of us are no doubt aware these days, the pretense of offering relief, the Israeli state with full backing from the United States, has turned humanitarian aid in Gaza into a trap. The new aid effort, which was promoted as a lifeline, has instead become an instrument of death, dangling a carrot before desperate starving people, only for the carrots to end up being replaced by bullets. It isn't an aid scheme, it's a mechanism for population control, displacement and extermination, and the man seen as instrumental in its setup is now seen as the main perpetrator across Gaza. If Donald Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff was hoping to be remembered as a peace negotiator and humanitarian, he has a very funny way of showing it. The deadly attacks at aid distribution sites in Rafah and elsewhere are now referred to by Palestinians as the Witkoff Massacre, laying bare the monstrous abuse of power and good faith that Witkoff has spent, having fronted the ceasefire proposal, and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF, is no longer seen as a diplomat, but as little more than a butcher in a suit. The aid programme has become a coordinated killing of desperate civilians near aid distribution points, representing not just a war crime, but a brutal culmination of Israel's genocidal intent in Gaza, now seen to have been aided and abetted in that by Witkoff, a man purportedly sent to broker peace, who has instead been instrumental in perpetuating violence. Also having offered up a ceasefire Israel could accept only because it promised no peace at all, and resulting in Hamas, of course, refusing it, with all of the media fallout and blame that immediately attracted. But you don't need to take my word for this. Amidst the overwhelming evidence of premeditated harm, because a testimony from Euromed Human Rights Monitor is possibly the most damning description of Israel's aid abuse going, and others from Gaza's own doctors who describe the trauma unfolding in clinics stripped of even basic resources in order to treat people who came looking for aid and found only death and destruction. Right, so the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF, heavily backed by the US and spearheaded by Steve Witkoff, has featured in a number of my recent videos. The starvation of the people of Gaza, arguably now their biggest enemy over and above Israel. But only Israel and this US administration could possibly find a way to combine those two dangers and turn not just the starvation, but the delivery of the aid itself into a weapon as well. The GHF was introduced as a supposedly apolitical alternative to UNRWA, who were competent and capable of delivering aid, which is exactly why Israel didn't like them and therefore they had to go. Registered in Geneva, the GHF is staffed not by impartial aid workers, seemingly, but by former CIA operatives and US military contractors operating under Israeli military supervision, mercenaries. The GHF aid distribution centres are high-security zones surrounded by fences and surveillance, more closely resembling prison camps than humanitarian assistance. It was in these supposedly safe zones that Israeli forces began firing on civilians, though. Just yesterday, at least 32 Palestinians were killed at aid distribution centres run by the GHF in Rafah in southern Gaza and near the Netzarim corridor in central Gaza. Only days earlier, on the 27th of May, a similar attack claimed the lives of 10 more. These massacres are not accidents, they're the direct consequence of an aid mechanism that is fundamentally militarised and with intent. According to Gaza's government media office, 49 Palestinians have been killed and over 305 injured by Israeli fire near aid distribution points since May 27th alone. Israeli drones have been documented firing on unarmed people gathering near food convoys, particularly in the Netzarim corridor. This systemic violence has shown that far from the GHF being a relief operation, it is instead a tool of ethnic cleansing. Palestinian civilians, misled by promises of safety and sustenance, walk into what are essentially Israeli-controlled kill zones. This is why Palestinians have begun referring to the entire aid framework in the last few days as the Witkoff Massacre, a name that explicitly assigns blame to who they feel is responsible. Ramy Abdu, head of the Euromed Human Rights Monitor, has been amongst the most vocal voices documenting this nightmare, and in a blistering statement following the June 1st massacre, Abdu accused Israel of weaponising starvation and aid, whilst also spreading propaganda about it, saying, "The video released by the Israeli army spokesman to deny Israel's responsibility for the massacre of starving civilians near the US aid distribution point in Rafah has backfired and turned into a scandal. The footage actually shows a gang supported by Israel stealing 7 flour trucks in Khan Yunis, not Rafah. When civilians tried to recover some of the stolen aid, the gang, operating under an Israeli drone's watch, opened fire. Anyone who attempted to take a bag of flour without paying 100 shekels, roughly $30, was shot at or beaten by the gang backed by the occupation army. All of this unfolded under Israeli drones who simply observed and did nothing. The aerial footage broadcast by the army, meant to evade blame for the Witkoff massacre, ultimately exposed another crime, the protection and sponsorship of looting gangs. He added 5 contradictory narratives were put forward by the Israeli army in a failed attempt to deny responsibility for the Witkoff Massacre near the joint US-Israeli aid distribution point in Rafah. First, it claimed that nothing had happened at all. Then it admitted an incident had occurred but not near the aid centre and unrelated to the army, releasing footage showing aid being distributed as usual. Next, it acknowledged its soldiers had fired shots but only into the air. It then claimed that no one had been hurt. However, the ICRC later confirmed that its field hospital in Rafah had received 21 dead bodies. Finally, the Israeli army published a video, widely described as scandalous, trying to suggest the shooters were Hamas militants. The footage was in fact from a different location entirely and showed looting gangs backed by Israel. Israel is a state built on lies. It lies as naturally as it breathes. These are not hyperbolic claims either. I've covered the case of Israeli sponsoring looting gangs previously in another video, including individuals linked to ISIS no less, protected by Israel, given security force uniforms, but who do nothing but steal what little aid Israel is letting in to ensure the starvation of the Gazan population continues. And without some kind of external intervention, a military one, a humanitarian one, there's no negotiating with Netanyahu's insane government anymore. This is going to continue. Every aspect of the GHF operation, from its staff and structure to its site locations, has been shaped to serve Israeli military strategy. Aid sites were deliberately placed to encourage population movement away from northern Gaza, a region Israel has repeatedly sought to depopulate and is using aid distribution to do that again now. The fact that these locations were later targeted with lethal force clearly suggests deliberate intent, not random collateral damage. And given the Israeli backing to the GHF, it's not hard to believe that anymore, is it? The brutality of these attacks extends far beyond the death toll, though. In the aftermath of the Rafah attack, hospitals received victims with catastrophic injuries, many of whom were children and elderly people. Quds News Network spoke to several of them, as this excerpt shows. Australian emergency physician Dr. Ramy Abdu, who arrived in Gaza just days ago, said the trauma is unlike anything he has witnessed before. Today we had a mass casualty event, he said. Hundreds of injured, dozens already confirmed dead. The hospital is overwhelmed. We're running out of ketamine, dressings and chest tubes. He added these are all civilian injuries, gunshot wounds, shrapnel. British surgeon Dr. Victoria Rowe, speaking from Nasser Medical Complex, said conditions are catastrophic. We've had a shooting at the GHF aid distribution centre near Rafah. It's absolute carnage. All the beds are full of people with gunshot wounds. We've had hundreds coming through the door. It's beyond capacity. Dr. Thomas Patokar, a British surgeon and veteran of 16 medical missions to Gaza, said this is the worst he has seen in the enclave. On top of the constant bombardment and huge numbers of injuries, there's widespread malnutrition. Patients' wounds aren't healing. Everything's getting infected. Most hospitals in the north are no longer functional. 80% of our patients are women and children. Worth remembering all of that the next time Israel claims they're only targeting Hamas, eh? The psychological toll is just as severe. Survivors are beginning to fear the aid itself. Where food trucks once offered the possibility of survival, they're now invoking dread. Israel has effectively turned famine into psychological warfare. The betrayal of Gaza is not limited to bullets and bombs. It also includes words, specifically the empty promises of a ceasefire negotiated by Steve Witkoff. The original terms of the ceasefire proposal were cautiously accepted by Hamas. These included a phased truce, exchange of hostages, Israeli military withdrawal, and a guarantee of no renewed fighting. What Hamas ultimately received bore little resemblance to that. The altered proposal, quietly adjusted behind closed doors it seems, instead offered no binding commitment to end the war at all. Israel would retain military control of Gaza at that. No clear path to reconstruction or sovereignty was offered. So should we really be surprised, therefore, that Hamas rejected it in the end? The fact that Israel accepted this plan should have been the first warning to everybody watching. A country that has rejected dozens and dozens of ceasefire initiatives over the past 20 months, each one calling for a cessation of hostilities, and suddenly they accept this deal? Well, of course they did. It offered them everything they actually wanted, and the Palestinians nothing. And again, this was Witkoff giving assurances to Hamas, and then returning with a deal that Israel may have just written themselves. There's no impartiality in negotiations involving the US. Steve Witkoff's appointment as envoy was never about peace, and that much has become ever more obvious now. As a real estate mogul with deep ties to the Trump family and Israeli business interests, Witkoff's placement signalled the US government's true priorities, which was optics over outcomes, containment over compassion, and designs on the real estate that is how the Gaza Strip is still being viewed by the big orange blimp passing himself off as the US president. By pushing forward the GHF initiative and laundering it through the optics of a Swiss-based NGO, the US has created performative humanitarianism, one where they can claim to be helping while instead they're enabling Israel's genocide instead. The rejection of Hamas's legitimate ceasefire amendments, which called only for clear guarantees that Israel wouldn't resume attacks and would leave Gaza, further proves the duplicity. When the US turned down these modest demands, despite having previously called them acceptable and reasonable, it made clear that Washington's goal was not peace, but whatever Israel actually wants. And in their effort to shield Israel from accountability, American officials have become partners in atrocity, and Witkoff's name is now synonymous with that amongst ordinary Palestinians. The name Witkoff Massacre did not emerge from headlines or Western media. It came from the mouths of Palestinian people themselves, those who survived the shootings at GF sites, those who treated the wounded, and those burying the dead are all pointing to the same conclusion. The aid programme is a death trap, and Steve Witkoff is the architect. The question now is not whether this was a massacre. It clearly was. The question is whether the world will continue to keep on looking away. The United Nations has so far failed to meaningfully intervene, which is getting harder and harder to accept. Western governments remain paralysed by pro-Israel lobbying and political cowardice. And the mainstream media still reports these events as clashes and people at the aid centres as dying, as if they are just spontaneously imploding and shuffling off this mortal coil. There's no equivalence here. One side controls the airspace, the drones, the border crossings, the media narrative, the bullets, and now all of the aid. The other side queues for that aid, for that food, only to be shot. Justice demands a reckoning. Steve Witkoff certainly has to be investigated for his role in these atrocities. The Palestinians certainly blame him. How much is that blame definitely attributable to him? What has he been doing behind the closed doors? What has been going on with meetings with Israel that have led to a deal that Hamas can't accept and yet Israel somehow can? It's got to be done, not only for the misleading ceasefire deal, but for his involvement in establishing a humanitarian system in the GHF as well, designed to do anything but provide aid to desperate people in the most dire need. Israeli officials responsible for authorising these strikes must also be prosecuted under international law. And the United States must face the moral and legal implications of underwriting such a campaign. Fat chance of that happening, though. The killing of 49 Palestinians, many of them children, at aid centres across Gaza is not a footnote in this war. It literally is the war. It's a war on kids. It's been called that so many times now. It is some of the clearest evidence yet that Israel, backed by the US, has transformed humanitarian infrastructure into just another weapon to turn on the people of Gaza. It is also a damning indictment of a world order where power speaks louder than pain and where even hunger now gets weaponized. The term Witkoff Massacre will be remembered, but remembrance alone is not enough. If the world fails to act, fails to condemn, to investigate, to stop, the next massacre will not be an accident. It will be an expectation, and just naming it after those behind it again won't change anything. For more on the sponsored Gaza aid thieves protected by the IDF and the Israeli state, check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't already done so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.